7th, 2025, 7:30 a.m. And this is the meeting of the Edina Housing and Redevelopment Authority. We are doing these meetings as we are with city council meetings in a hybrid fashion. Folks will be able to watch the meeting and participate in the meeting, at least in one instance this morning, on community comment. So those watching on cable TV or via computer, we'll make sure that you have a chance to participate in community comment. A reminder that your remarks are limited to 3 minutes, and it can't be a topic that's on the agenda today or scheduled for a future public hearing. And having provided that information, we will now ask that the roll be called. Who's our executive director and city manager, Scott Neal, is going to call the roll.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Risser.
Here.
Commissioner Jackson.
Here.
Commissioner Pierce.
Here.
Commissioner Agnew.
Here.
Chair Hovland.
Here. Next is the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thanks, everyone, for that. And we have a form of meeting agenda. Is there anyone on the HRA or on staff that wishes to modify the agenda in any form or fashion? Is there a motion to approve the meeting agenda as published?
So moved. A second.
Mr. Jackson moves. Commissioner Agnew seconds the adoption of the meeting agenda as published. Any further conversation on that? All right, all those in favor of adopting the meeting agenda as published, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Carried. The meeting agenda is adopted. And now we are at community comment. So if there's anyone in the audience, we've got some of our residents in the audience this morning, and if anyone wants to address the HRA on a matter of concern to them that's not on the agenda today or scheduled for a future public hearing, feel free to come forward, and we'll hear those concerns or comments. And I'll turn.
We do not currently have any.
Yeah. Nothing. Anybody online?
No callers right now, but I do
Okay.
recommend that we wait about a minute before proceeding.
Thank you. All right, and then we'll move on to our executive director, who may have some remarks regarding people that appeared at the last HRA meeting.
I do not this morning.
Okay, very good. Then let's move on to the consent agenda. There are three items on the consent agenda. Does anyone on the HRA wish to remove an item from the consent agenda? All right, is there a motion to adopt the items on the consent agenda in a single motion?
So moved.
Second.
Mr. Jackson moves. Commissioner Pierce seconds the adoption of the items on the consent agenda in a single motion. Any further discussion on that? All those in favor of adoption of the motion as stated, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Carried. The items on the consent agenda are adopted. And now we are on to the heart of the meeting, which is the reports and recommendations portion of the meeting. And the first matter in front of us is for discussion only. But I think we reached the point where the staff would like a little guidance from the HRA, at least a conversation about an issue that we know that's been ongoing in nature, and that's challenges around, I think, getting this project that we approved at 70th and France at the U.S. Bank site, keep it moving forward. It's been stalled out for primarily reasons unrelated to the developer. Outside economic conditions and land, labor, lumber, as they say, interest rates, all these things have caused this project to not move forward as fast as we thought. And you've been creative, I think, from a staff standpoint and from a developer standpoint about trying to think of ways that we could keep this project moving forward. And we're going to hear a little bit about that this morning. So our Economic Development Director, Bill Neuendorf, has this matter, and we've got folks with us this morning from Orion Investments, from Mortensen, and others as well to talk about this. So welcome, Mr. Neuendorf. Nice to have you here this morning.
Great, thank you, of course. And as you mentioned, this conversation is for discussion only at this point, but we think we have enough information put together for you to help you understand what the proposal could look like and to really gauge your level of interest in moving forward. At our previous meeting, I did do a brief overview and introduction that we'd be coming back with a proposal that looked like this. So in your packet, there is an outline more of a structural arrangement of how the modification of the financing and the TIF agreement could work. But for the presentation this morning, I'm not going to get into the nuts and bolts so much as the concepts. I think that's more important. So I put a brief presentation together that I'll walk through. Of course, this morning we are joined by the developers from Orion Investments and Mortensen Development Company, and also Nick Anhut with Ehlers Associates, the city's consultant, is here as well. This team has been chatting about this project on a regular basis for the last several years. In the last several months, we've accelerated those conversations to try to think of more creative ways to move forward, as you'd mentioned, since a lot of the traditional ways were not working in the economy the last couple of years. So as we put this proposal in summary form together for you, a couple questions to consider, and then we'll come back to these same questions at the end. And these are some fundamental questions about whether or not the HRA would be interested in using our various financing abilities to pursue this project, of course, provided that the city's credit rating would not be impacted. Is the HRA interested in potential debt repayment if there's full coverage, full commitments from the developers or the owners of the building without risk to the city? Is the HRA interested in moving forward if we need to rely on our tax levy as a secondary payment source? That'd be an alternate to the second question. And then fundamentally, if this proposal is not of interest to the HRA, are we willing to see this proposal not advance and not move forward in a timely fashion? So something to think about as we run through this. Of course, we know the site at 70th and France. As a refresher, this is the site plan that was approved back in 2022. The developers had acquired the nearly 6-acre parcel from U.S. Bank. The bank needed to relocate to a newer facility. That's in the southwestern corner of the property. That project advanced right on schedule. One of the challenges of this overall project was before the developers could start doing anything on their land, they had to move the bank. They couldn't tear down the old buildings until that new bank was up and operational. So from the get-go, we knew there'd be about a year to maybe an 18-month delay in the developers starting the bigger projects while the bank built theirs, and that was part of the original assumption. But the bank is finished, and then Site A is the northeast corner of the parcel. That would be the residential high-rise. Site B was an 8-story professional office, and then Site C in the southeast corner is the parking structure. Renderings of what the office and the residential look like. Then a different view. Also, as a reminder, both the office and the residential do have their own internal parking, as well as commercial space, retail and restaurant space on the first floors. But due to the scale of the project and the commercial nature of the businesses, they do need the separate parking in Site C, which is shown here in the right hand of the image. These are renderings of the approved garage, the way it was designed a few years ago. A couple of different angles of that. And then part of the rationale why we even considered getting involved in the first place, our Greater Southdale plan, the vision for that district, made a strong recommendation to shift away from individual private parking lots to more of a district model where shared parking can be used. This is a model that has worked successfully for the city of Edina at 50th and France, and also to a lower scale over in Grandview by Jerry's, where the various properties there work together on a shared parking garage rather than each one having their own individual private lots. We find it to be more land efficient if you can share parking. And that was one of the recommendations in our Greater Southdale plan. The challenges, these should not be a surprise to anybody, but one of the biggest conditions is the rise of interest rates, the rise of inflation, and just hesitancy in the capital markets to fund large projects like this. From a numbers perspective, we had Nick at Ellers run some numbers, and initially we were anticipating financing this project at just over 4%. Well, today in the real world, we're hoping to get 6.5%. That makes a dramatic increase to the time value of the cash flow of that project. So initially, we were looking at a funding gap of $22 million. That was the gap that we were using TIF to fill a few years ago. Well, today, with the same project, the same cash flow, the same time frame, but only that interest rate adjustment, while we used to get $22 million in the TIF increment, with the increased inflation rate, that's been reduced down to 17. So just assuming nothing else changed, assuming everything else was the same, we already are at a $4.7 million shortfall. We also know construction costs have increased, but also there is strong interest in this area by professional office users. The developer is having strong success at the Craftsman office that broke ground at 7250 France just a few weeks ago, and they think that interest is strong enough to move forward with this project. But the first thing we have to do is figure out how to resolve this new shortfall. The impacts to both projects are real. The Site A, the residential building, does also see a devaluation of the $5 million TIF pledge that was proposed for that. But at this point, the developer of the residential is not ready to proceed, and so we're really kind of putting that one on the back burner for the time being. But the Site B, we think, is ready to go, and so we've been trying to find a creative way to restructure that TIF payment so that they can move forward and bridge that gap. A couple of fundamentals to consider as we move forward, and these were in the back of our heads as we sat down and started brainstorming with the city's consultants. We had input from Jay Lindgren at Dorsey and Whitney, and Nick Anhunt from Ellers, as well as the Mortensen team and the Orion team, looking back at some of their past projects and other projects they do around the country. A couple of the fundamentals, though, is just the fact that the city and the HRA have some of the strongest borrowing power in the area. We have strong credit ratings, AAA ratings from both S&P and Moody's. There's the fact that governments with the strongest credit can typically borrow funds at lower interest rates than a private developer could. We considered whether or not the city or the HRA or possibly even creating a special purpose entity, like an LLC essentially, a joint partnership to take the lead on this. They can borrow at tax-exempt rates if the project is for a public purpose. So a public parking garage, a public intersection, a sewage treatment plant, like those types of things. In our case, as long as the parking garage is considered public parking, it would qualify for that tax-exempt type of rate. We also realized that an even lower interest rate could be secured if the city was willing to pledge guaranteed repayment of this cash flow. So just like when we issue a bond to redo a road or build the fire station, we pledge the full faith and credit of the city to make sure that loan is repaid, whether the actual source is tax increment or sales tax or whatever the finite source is. We get the best borrowing power if we pledge that full security of the city or the HRA. And so those are a couple things we talked about to see if we could actually use those and apply that to this project. We came to the conclusion at the bottom that we could move this project forward most efficiently if we combine the tax-exempt financing supported by a repayment pledge from the city. That would lower the cost of borrowing to a point where we resolve that gap that the interest rate had created for us. So I'll walk briefly through the outline of how that deal could be structured, because there's impacts to what we just suggested. So in your packet, I believe there's a 5-page bullet point type summary. I'm going to keep it to just the highlights here, because the real conversation is really about the impacts. Not, if this is something we want to move forward with, we'll come back, we'll have a full contract for you, we'll have all the details worked out, but just as an overview of how this could work. So working with the developers, we realized that if only the office building is ready to move forward today, we could construct that separate parking garage in 2 phases, taking advantage of the underground parking in the office, plus using Site A as a temporary surface lot for a couple hundred stalls. That would lower the cost of building the initial parking garage. That could save some money. That also gives us time so that when Site A is ready to go, we could see what the parking world is like in a few years. We know that the parking requirements are changing dramatically around the country, as well as locally. So perhaps in a few years, we might not need to build so much parking. That this would give us a few years of time to see what the real parking demand is, and then make that decision whether or not to finish the initial garage to go to its full height, or maybe we're sufficient where we are. So just kind of putting that placeholder in there. We would consider the creation of a special purpose entity that could be used as a guide to this partnership between the developer of the office building and the HRA and the city. We could rely on the HRA or city's credit to secure debt, or we could work through that special purpose entity and rely on a lease commitment, a long-term lease commitment from the city or the HRA to support repayment of the debt on the garage. That would be done in lieu of the more traditional private route of going to the lenders, going to the banks, getting a mortgage or a construction loan on the project. There would actually be more of a debt issue, of a bond issued on it. One of the big changes with that this structure would eliminate the TIF note that was originally anticipated. So as you recall, the city pledged to provide a $17 million TIF note that we'd use to reimburse the developer for their expense. If we go with an alternative structure as we're discussing here today, that TIF note goes away, but the same TIF dollars that are coming in the door would go out the door to pay for the bond. We would also reach potentially contractual arrangements between the city and the developer.
Would you explain that again?
Sure.
The TIF is gone, but really it's not, because the TIF is gone, we're not really using TIF payments to pay the debt. We're using our general taxing authority on the levy to pay the debt. Is that what you meant?
That's the distinction. So if you fast forward in time a little bit, the project's finished and it's paying its taxes. So the base taxes go to the schools, the county, like they always do, and the city. But that tax increment is still being generated. Mm-hmm. What we typically would do, what our current arrangement says, is that upon completion, we give the developer a $17 million TIF note, and we take that tax increment that comes in from the project, and we pay down the note to his borrowing costs. In this arrangement, we're proposing that he doesn't take on the borrowing, either the city or a special purpose entity takes on the borrowing. So the $17 million, so the TIF payments don't go to the developer, they go to the debt holder that issued the debt on the parking garage. So it's the same cash flow, but in order to get an attractive rate, that's where we have to think about, what if there's not enough TIF? We always think about what if something goes wrong, right? Because we hope it all goes right, but what if it goes wrong? We don't want to be on the short end of the stick. And so one of the options, if there's a shortfall, is that we could rely on the city's or the HRA's taxing authority to make up any shortfall. That's an option. Or we could try to mitigate that risk by reaching an agreement with the developer where if there's a shortfall, somehow they're going to be on the hook for it, either through a personal commitment, special assessment to the property, charging for parking in the ramp and relying on that revenue. There's several different mitigation sources there.
Commissioner Jackson has a question for you.
Yes, so the TIF note goes away, but the TIF district does not. Is that correct? So
Correct.
The structure for gathering that increment is still in place, but instead of paying off a TIF note, it's paying off this other debt instrument.
That's exactly correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for that. Commissioner Risser.
Procedurally, how would this move forward, and specifically, what would be opportunities for public involvement? Would there need to be public hearings on this?
From a financing perspective, I don't believe there's a public hearing required. We've already done that when we established the TIF district. So the public input on the financing proposal would just be our normal input through the city council. The temporary use of the parking lot, or the temporary use of Site A as a parking lot instead of a building right away, I believe that has to go back to either planning commission or council from a zoning perspective, and there might be a public hearing there, I'm not certain. But that would be from a land use perspective, not a financing perspective.
You have further slides you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, yep,
Okay.
a few more.
Yeah, go on, keep
We've
going.
also started thinking about day-to-day operations and maintenance. So we would come to an agreement with the developer that the owner of that office building, would be responsible for those costs: cleaning, electricity, security, minor repairs, things that are associated with it. And then from a long-term perspective, 20 years down the road, the city owns the ramp. Let's say there's a $5 million modification needed. We could use a special assessment process to assess those costs back to the benefiting properties. And these last two arrangements we've basically copied from how we do things at 50th and France, where the businesses that use the property and benefit from it pay those daily costs. We've done the same thing at Grandview. So a couple risks to consider, because this is different from our traditional pay-as-you-go TIF note. One of the initial risks is the marketplace. This is a creative solution. We think it could solve the problem, but there's still no guarantee that the private market is going to jump on this right away. So things that are easy would have been done already. The developer still has to go and lock in the equity, lock in the debt on the project, bring in the tenants. So they still have a big workload ahead of them. The other question is how the investors will respond and the debt issuers will respond. Is the bond offering that we put out there of enough interest to get good rates? With the full backing of the city, I think there'd be strong interest. With limited support and no shortfall agreement with the developer, I'm questioning if we'd even get a better rate or not. So those are a couple questions that are still out there, and we'll resolve as we keep going here. But what are the potential risks to the city, and how does this impact our overall finances? I think that's the big question here, because we think we can get all the nuts and bolts to work fine, but what's the potential impact to us? Will the issuance of this debt have a negative impact on the city's credit rating? That's something to really take into consideration, considering that in the next couple years, we're going to be building Fred Richards Park, Braemar Arena, entering into a long-term lease for the Art Center, building a new fire station, hopefully a third fire station in the next few years, plus our typical road projects. We're doing a lot of big capital improvements. And whether the city issues the debt on our behalf or whether we enter into a long-term lease, the credit agencies will notice that. Second question is there enough incremental taxes to actually repay the debt? If all goes perfectly well, there will be. But what if there isn't? That's something to keep in mind. And there's ways to mitigate that, but I don't want to ignore it. Potentially, will additional bond payments be required from the city? We have our general levy. We could always go to that, but I know there's been lots of conversations about our levy. So again, I don't want to hide that. Some of the mitigation factors that we've discussed so far are identifying alternative sources to supplement tax increment if there's a shortfall. I'd mentioned charging revenues for the parking, whether it's to the tenants in the buildings or the general public, issue special assessments to the owner of the building, which would then trickle down to the tenants of the building. There's also TIF pooling. We have a little bit of money left in the Centennial Lakes Fund that we could pool into there if we wished. There's also the ability to establish minimum assessment agreements on both sites to have the owners to commit to a certain value of their properties and guarantee that they will not protest to get any lower valuation. We do that quite regularly. We could also pursue personal guarantees from the developer or letters of credit from the developer. So there are ways to mitigate that risk to the city about repayment. So in conclusion, I'll wrap this up. What is the developer asking for and what aren't they asking for? In this proposal, they're not asking for any additional expenditure of TIF monies than we've already pledged. The dollar amount is the same, but how those dollars get put into the deal is asked to be changed. They are asking to modify the method that we use TIF monies to finance that garage, and they are asking for the city to consider using a full commitment from the city, whether it's through direct borrowing or entering into a long-term lease, to try to get the lowest possible borrowing rate for the project. And then the one thing I haven't touched on, and this is where I'll close, the fundamental difference in this proposal does create two different benefits to the city. At the end of the lease or the repayment of the debt, the city will own the parking garage forever. That can be a blessing and a curse. We own a piece of real estate, we own an asset, it's been well maintained, we've got agreements with the developers and owners to keep it in good condition, but they get expensive. We've seen that at 50th and France. There's repairs that are needed every year after they get to a certain point, and that gets expensive. So while there can be the pros and the cons there, but fundamentally, the reason that we're bringing this forward is we do think it's a way to create a path to get this big, ambitious project that we approved a few years ago remotivated and get it back in the marketplace with the hopes to really reinvigorate that corner. So I'll close where we ended with those 4 basic questions. We're not looking for any formal action today. It's strictly for discussion. But we're at a point in time where general direction is really helpful to the developer, so they know how to proceed. Right? They're actively out there in the marketplace. They're wondering if they've got a path in an alternative method or not. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Mr. Chair. I'm happy to answer any questions. I will rely a lot on Mr. Anhut from Mellors and our folks from Orion and Mortensen as well. But with that, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm wondering if before the commissioners ask questions and Commissioner Agnew is ready to go, her inquisitive mind has some, and everybody else up here too, I think, questions and concerns. I wonder if we should hear from the developer about their perspective on this and why this has evolved. Might help us background the situation a little bit more thoroughly.
Well, good morning, Commissioners and Chair. Ted Carlson with Orion Investments. Nice to see you today. I think what our team at Orion and the Mortensen team are looking to accomplish is a mechanism for us to develop the sites independently. And ultimately, with the structure of the TIF notes and the way it's set up today, we're not able to do that. And so with the help of Bill and Nick and team at looking at different creative ways to finance this project, if we're able to work on some type of structure that Bill outlined today, that would give the opportunity for the office site and the multifamily site, or whatever that site may be in the future, to develop independently. Similarly to what we're doing right now at 7200 and 7250 France, where we've got adjacent sites, brings the guidelines to life, different uses, mixed uses, but they're financed differently with different structure, different equity, different debt. And so I think for our perspective, as the markets have shifted and changed, that in order for us to make this project happen, we need to be able to decouple the financing between the two sites.
Okay, thanks for that. Stand by, you might want to just stay right there. I'm going to go to Commissioner Agnew.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Manager Nurendorf, for the overview this morning. So it feels to me, based on what you said, that we as a city would be assuming more risk in this. I want to make sure I'm understanding that correctly. So can you speak a little bit more in depth about the change in our risk profile, knowing that typically when we agree to TIF agreements, pay as you go, it is a lot less risky for us as a city. So speak more to that if you could, please.
Sure. Happy to address that. So there's two types of risk that get added to the conversation. Because you're right, with the pay-go note, the risk is all with the developer, and the city just uses TIF as a reward when they're finished. So the two types of risk that we're now getting involved in is the risk of impact to the city's credit rating, because whether we issue the debt or whether we sign a long-term lease, the credit agencies will notice that we have some type of commitment in the $17 million range. So is that enough to damage us or injure our credit rating? I'll leave that to Mr. Anhut. He might have some comments there, but you never really know until it happens. But just looking at everything that's on our plate, there is some risk there. And the second risk is debt repayment. The TIF increment from the parking garage, the TIF increment from the office should pay about half of the debt, guaranteed. The project gets finished, gets built, gets leased up, we've got at least half of it covered. That's half. So that's why we're thinking about building the deck in two phases, about 50 or 60% of it now, and come back and finish it later to try to minimize that delta. But there's always the risk that, let's say, the office finishes and it's assessed at a lower value, or maybe they lease 80% of it and they just can't get to 95%, which is where they all want to be. There's some risk there. And so if there is a shortfall in the tax increment, then we have a couple choices, either that can fall back on the city or the HRA, and we'd have to figure out where that revenue is coming from. The easy thing is also the hardest thing, our tax levy. Easiest to do and hardest to do at the same time, hardest to stomach perhaps at this point. But there's alternatives to that. There's shortfall agreements with the developers. There's revenues that can be generated from the garage, and then special assessments that can be wrapped into the whole deal. So there's ways to mitigate it, but that's still a risk. So those are the two types of risks that are now on our side of the ledger.
Thank you for going through that. So I want to dig in more to the parking itself. So would you be viewing this as district parking or site-specific parking?
In order to qualify for tax-exempt parking or tax-exempt financing, it would have to be public parking, which is defined as 50% of the parking must be public. So we'll have to really test what's in the marketplace. Right now, the existing garage has, I think, one level, all public parking, and then the upper levels, public parking in the evenings and weekends. That probably hits the 50% threshold right there. But as we get into it, we'd want to make sure that that's sufficient. While the parking is needed for the tenants aren't there on weekends, but all the shoppers at the Galleria are. Other businesses in the area are there on the weekends. The Pancake House overflows every Saturday and Sunday. So the garage would be available for that, and it would have to be public. If we don't pass that threshold, we lose our lending advantages, our borrowing advantages.
Thank you. So as we talk about the potential phasing, first, can you speak to me about when the ramp would be built in comparison to Site B?
Sure. So we will work hard to minimize any risk to the city. So the construction of Site C would be triggered after the full financing of Site B office. So once they know that they've got their debt and equity and they've got their pre-leasing all ready to go and they're ready to close on the deal, that will be the trigger to us that it's not just a proposal, it's really happening, and then we would start moving on Site C. It would take the city time, to do full design, construction design. We'd have to bid it. We'd have to hire a construction manager like we just did for the Fred and for the fire station. So that takes time. We'd recommend not investing our time and treasure until we know Site B is ready to go. As fortunately, it takes less time to build a parking garage than it does a full-blown office building. So even if the parking garage construction starts a little bit after the office, they can still be delivered at about the same time. That way it reduces risk to the city. What we don't want to do is have the city build a parking garage in the middle of a vacant lot and have nothing else happen. That would be injurious to us.
Right, exactly, thank you. So do both sites A and B need additional parking, or are we talking about staggering it because we could use the empty lot of Site A to compensate for some of that?
Yeah, we're proposing to stagger it just to reduce the financial exposure up front. If we know that we've got an acre and a half of surface parking lot, let's rely on that first. It saves a whole lot of money. That's why we're proposing to stagger it.
So do both A and B require more parking than what's provided in the buildings themselves?
The Site B office does for sure. The Site A residential, I think is, as I recall, is self-parked. Self-parked. Yeah, I mean, because the Site A also has a lot of public space on the first level as well, the first level and a half, I think a little bit lower in the main level. Yeah, so I'm sorry, I'm getting over a cold, so thoughts are not always directly in order this week. So Site A is self-parked. Site B needs the parking garage.
Okay, and so we could potentially evaluate if we only did half of the parking ramp or some portion of it, and we were seeing not full utilization between the surface lot and the parking ramp, we could potentially decrease the overall scale of the parking ramp at that point in time if it's identified that there isn't as much of a need for it. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. I think that those are my questions. Thank you.
We'll come back to you if you think of more. Commissioner Pierce.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have a couple of questions, but I'm not sure what I think about doing this, and so it is really complicated, but in my mind, it reminds me of this story I would use for an ERP team that I was trying to rescue a project, and we kept pushing the date. And I asked them if they knew what it meant when you were in a boat, there's a hole in the boat, what do you do? And everybody said, well, we start, right? You have to bail the water out of the boat. And I said, that's true. But if you just bail the water and you don't know where the hole is, then the chances that you're going to save yourself it's just a guess, right? And I said, so you have to have the discipline, even though you're behind on a project, to stop and then reassess where you are, where you're trying to go, to figure out what really is the issue, and then focus on that issue. And so, like, this kind of feels like that to me, but, and so, are we solving the right problem? And so I hear, maybe the problem really isn't the financing. Maybe the problem is the kind of development that we approved. I don't know the answer to that. Is this really about a financial construct that won't allow the two sites to be developed separately or independently? Or is it that we can't finance the development? We can't, and so I hear, well, we can't get enough private investment. And so is it really the construct, or is it we can't get enough financing? And so when I think about it in that way, it just strikes me when you look at the overall market. So I heard you say, well, tenants want office space. And I know this example I'm going to give isn't the same, but I'm trying to paint the market. So we've said we can't secure enough private investment. You actually said, well, if we do the parking ramp in a few years, we just talked about this, a few years, because the market is changing in transportation patterns, we may not need as much parking as we do today. And then you said, we really don't know, right? So we're going to put that into part of a solution to a problem, and we're not really even sure if we need all the parking yet. And then so I think that has to do with what the market is. And then this is the example of the Ameriprise Tower. So you go downtown, and granted, it's a different market, right? Minneapolis is not Edina. But when you step back and look at the trends, that leads me to where I started, right? Is our issue financing? Maybe financing is a symptom, but there's some other issue. And I don't want to today dive into asking questions of how to enable the solution that you're providing, because I personally think that's it's not constructive, in my opinion. It will be more constructive to have, and we set this path, so this is not about you. You came before and told us this is the next thing we're going to do. And so I'm not, however, if there were 3 options, and I'm making up the number 3, you had one in here that says, we're done, we're out. Maybe a second one is looking at the development and looking at our policies, like asking the question we asked the Enclave developer for the Macy's site, why is it so expensive? Are there things that we're requiring as a city that make this development more expensive that you can finance? Maybe that's the problem we need to solve. We've had that as an issue before with other developments. And we've talked about some of those challenges. And so where I am at the moment, you're just asking for feedback. It strikes me that if we can't fund it through private investment, we've already committed $22 million. And when you went through that analysis, you said, well, that's not enough based on what the market is dictating. There's a shortfall. It feels like we're bailing water. And I don't know that that's a good position for us to be in as a city with the risk profile that you're framing if we do that. And so that's that's where I am today. Today. I don't know that I'm expecting an answer from any of the questions. I'm just giving you where my head space is today. Thank you.
Thank you. And we've had several conversations that followed your direct line of thought. I know the developer has looked at a lot of different options. I don't know if you have time to take the time to talk about that, but they have spent months looking at other options.
I think you should opine on that,
Yeah, sure. Well,
That's a really important question.
Yeah, I
Do
think
we have
it's
the right project in these times?
yeah, it's a great question, great dialogue. Thank you for the opportunity. You know, we first of all, you know, utmost respect to this group and staff is we wouldn't be here if we didn't think that the programming for the office building was spot on and dialed with the market. That's our job and our responsibility. We're having success a block and a half away. So to the Ameriprise question, which I've answered probably 1,000 times over the past 90 days, is you've got a unique opportunity, a unique set of circumstances. And while they're both are called office, they're incredibly different. So I'll just leave it at that. And if we want to have a different deep dive on that, we can. But in our world, it's a little, you know, apples to potatoes. It's way different. As it relates to this, you know, we think this is the patch in the boat, not bailing water, frankly. We need the ability to build these sites independently. And currently, we don't have that ability. And so for us, it's, again, back to a decoupling. I think the risk profile can be further adjusted and measured. I think that's been crystal clear with Bill and his team, is that the city is not willing to take additional risk. So I think this dialogue is exactly what we need to figure out how can we bring a great project that brings a lot of jobs and a lot of investments to our community to life. That's what our focus is.
And so like that sounds great to me. But then when I go through the deck, we're asking for more money. And so then I would say, if the issue is we need to decouple the sites, then the problem is, how do we do that without putting the city at more risk and requiring more funding? Go solve that problem. If the issue is we just need to decouple, right? And so I have no issue with that, trying to figure that out. But what you're asking for is for the city to take on more debt, more risk in order to do that. And then on the Ameriprise, well, I started by saying it's a different market. However, it's happening everywhere. There's a letter in the packet about the public works site, right? So Jesters, cancel that contract. Why did we cancel that? Well, we canceled that because the 55 plus development couldn't get funding, right? It's not mixed use, right? It's residential, but they couldn't get funding. And so there's a laundry list, and you know, the last thing I'll say there, I'm actually on the board of a bank. We look at the risk profile of all that debt at the executive meeting every month. And so I can give you a list of things that can't get financing and companies that are defaulting on loans across residential, mixed use, and office. And so I use the Ameriprise because everybody knows that example. But my point is, the market is what it is. And so if the problem, that's what I would offer to you. If the problem is we need to decouple the sites so that we can develop them independently, come back with an option to do that that doesn't put the city at risk, that's not asking for more money, because we've already committed $22 million.
Thank you for those thoughts. Commissioner Jackson.
So I have a lot to follow on that, but I just want to ask, help me on, I guess I read this differently. Is this committing the city to more money and more risk, or just more risk?
It's more risk, and it might be more money if things go poorly,
Okay,
but we won't know until
and that's kind of the risk part of it.
then that's part of the risk.
Okay, but today you didn't take the initial TIF dollar amount and increase it?
No.
Okay, I want to be clear, because I think sort of, as we've talked behind the scenes about this over time, some of the different options did involve more money, and this one does not.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. So this is from Mr. Carlson. We looked at this as a prototype of the Southdale District and the Southdale guidelines. When you're looking at financing, are you finding in the market that there's a disconnect between what financial lenders are expecting from a project, because we're in a suburb and we're having an urban type of development. Is this not translating into the financial markets? Is this something that we should be aware of as we think about the Southdale guidelines? Or is this a problem that is just in my imagination, that there's a disconnect between, you know, a lender will say, okay, I'm building an office building in an urban area. Okay, I'm building an office building in a suburban area. The cost of parking in particular is very different and the revenues. Can you talk to a little bit about what the financial markets are telling you about offices and parking and the financing of that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll do my best to answer it. You know, as we look at the urban situation downtown, is that a lot of parking is not included. It's separate. It's paid. You know, it's public ramps and or private ramps. Here, the lender looks at is we need to provide a certain level of parking in order to secure financing, and we need to provide a certain level of parking in order to attract tenants. And that's what we need to provide on the site, and that's what we're programming for. So I think it's a combination of what does the income stream for development, which is tenancy, need, and what is that income stream that the lender underwrites provide to get them comfortable with the project. I don't know if that's answering your question, but that's, you know, we need to provide a certain level of parking availability to secure tenancy, which provides the income that the lenders will underwrite.
Okay, so you have to have there's parking minimums that are expected, and they're coupled with the office building, whereas Minneapolis, they're separate. Does that impact, does the requirement that the businesses pay for the parking that is coupled with the development, does that affect the lenders?
I would answer it this way, that it's not standard for suburban office to charge for parking. So it's a different metric, and it's a drag on a project. I think the district element is really unique here. I think the rest of the public improvement elements are very unique. So I think if you take the parking along with those other elements as a whole, that creates financing challenges, yes.
Okay, and then to follow on with that, if we go forward with this, how are the other public amenities on the site, the interior streets, the pocket park, will those be built with the office building? Because it seemed to me that those were initially tied to the apartment building, not to the commercial office building.
Yeah, great question. I think one of the things that we've held sacred throughout this process and dialogue is to maintain all the public elements that we've talked about for this project, to include the public street rooms, the street grid, the plaza, so on and so forth. There's also what we can't see is there's a ton of stormwater underground, which is very costly. So we've held that sacred and have not touched it, nor has the programming of the office changed as far as square footages and things like that. So, you know, if the office is built first, which is what we anticipate, that grid needs to be finished and completed, yes, in which case there would be a pad site ready at Site A for the multifamily tower that could be short-term surface parking, similar to the arrangement we looked at 7200, 7250 France.
Okay, so this is a question actually for Mr. Teague then, to follow up, and that is, does that change the land use that we approved, or maybe with a TIF agreement that we have? Does that trigger a whole new series of questions about land use, and it seems to me that's different from what we approved.
Yes, thank you for the question. So if surface parking would be utilized on the apartment site, it would have to go back through a site plan review process. So it would trigger public hearings, both Planning Commission and City Council. Okay, and similarly, if it's a smaller parking garage than initially approved, that also would trigger the land use questions? Not if just a portion of the parking structure were constructed. You know, if it was a change, got bigger, then it would have to go through, but just a reduced size parking structure with the ability to go up, that would not trigger a site plan review. And so this is a question to both of you, though. I mean, tell me about the public realm that we approved. You know, we've got the sidewalk along France, we've got the interior streets.
Is linking that to the commercial building instead of to the apartment building, is that a change in, does that require a whole new level of agreement, or is that something that can be, administratively changed? Help me understand the linkage between the interior, the public realm, and the two different buildings.
Do you have a SIPA for this yet?
Yeah, yes, for each site. So the public improvements, from what I just heard from Mr. Carlson, there would be no changes there, and that would be constructed as part of the office
Okay.
project, so no changes there.
Okay, so the linkage between the two buildings is not a land use question, it's just a financing question kind of thing.
Correct. And in the TIF agreement, the current agreement has a $5 million pledge to the residential for some of their qualified costs, and then a $17 million pledge to the office for some of their costs.
Okay, I couldn't remember
We have
that.
to amend both agreements to reflect this change. But if we move forward with the office separately, we would want, upon completion, the street grid must be going through, and the sidewalks have to connect to something, and the utilities need to connect to some other utility. So we'd figure out how to make that happen, and then that would put the residential building on its own timeline, whether that's 2 years out or 5 years out. But we'd want a sidewalk that's connected, and those kind of things we could make sure we get.
Okay, and then since both of you are up here, I'm going to take advantage of your expertise, and you can help me decide who needs to answer this. What are we hearing about the neighboring sites? Are there any, what is the long-term expectation for whether the neighboring sites would be redeveloped? Because I think the demand for district parking would be, right now there's probably some demand, but what's the anticipated future of the neighboring sites? Because that's kind of the keystone of this site, is if this could be the parking, then those sites could be developed with less parking. So what are you hearing about neighboring sites? Anything?
Well, I'll share what I know. I oftentimes we're the last to know when projects happen. But the shopping center to the south, Rue de France, was sold recently to an investor, Phillips Edison. They also own Centennial Shops, and they tend to buy successful retail properties and hold them as successful retail properties. In my experience, they don't buy them to tear them down and do something different, at least in the short term, maybe in the long term. We know the Guitar Center site has been the Bowers for a couple years now, so that piece is done. And the shopping center where the original Pancake House, Warner Stellians, I don't know. I hear that there's some interest in that site from developers, but I don't hear interest from the owners. And I don't know the status of their leases, how long those leases run. But I think that site, on this block, I think that would be the next site to change. But I don't have any indication that that is imminent. That could be 5 years out, 10 years out, 15 years out.
Yeah, and I have not received any inquiries about development of neighboring properties.
Okay, thank you. And then my next question is for Manager Neuendorf. We've been talking about the timing of this TIF district and when it's times out. Is that a part of the consideration of what we're doing? What's the time frame that we have to make this decision and get shovels in the ground?
Sure. When you establish a TIF district, this typical TIF law says you've got 5 years to finish your and lock in your qualified costs. The developer did what they said they would do, and they kept on that initial pace, expecting to get financing. So they tore down the buildings as soon as they could, started to try to get the site prepped and cleared and whatnot. But the minute we created that TIF district back in 2022, our 5-year clock started ticking. So right now, I think we're at, it's either June or July of 2027 is our 5-year rule to get expenses finished and a certificate of occupancy issued. that's pretty unlikely at this point. So we are at the Senate or at the state capitol seeking special legislation. There's a short list of cities up there for the same thing. This happens every year. So we are asking to change that 5-year rule to 10-year rule. That's usually what the Senate Taxes Committee likes to see, is going from 5 to 10. So that's what we're asking for. That does give us more time. Doesn't change the price, doesn't change the city's contribution. It gives the developer more time. That bill is moving forward. Whether it makes it into the final legislation, we won't know that until May. But that piece, I think, is critical, because even if the office starts taking tomorrow, the residential, we know, is not going to start tomorrow. So, and the residential is also a part of the cost. So having that special legislation is important. The main reason is, if we would let this TIF district expire and just close it out and start over from scratch another day, the blight has already been removed. So it's nearly impossible to create a TIF district on just a vacant piece of land. So if that were to happen, not only would the developer be in a hole, the community would be in a literal hole right now, because there'd be no ability to help with any kind of financing. So we're hoping to avoid that kind of doomsday scenario.
Okay, so my recommendation then is to table this until we know, because I don't think we should spend time and money on something that we just don't know whether it's feasible or not, based on that time clock. You brought up another question, though. Well, I'll think of it.
Just hold your thought for a second. This should have been the only thing on the agenda this morning. We're gonna roll till 9 o'clock just on this topic, and so I want to give other people a chance. I think we should let people leave, frankly, that are sitting here waiting, because I've got all kinds of questions. We haven't even gotten to Commissioner Mercer yet, Member Jackson. There's going to be a whole dialogue here that's going to easily take us a half an hour. So for the affordable housing report, for the chamber update, I think we should be letting people go from this agenda. I don't know, Mr. Executive Director, you may have some thoughts. We've got hard stops at 9.
Yeah, we do. So if we need to recalendar those items, those issues, we can.
Yep. Because we already had one person from the chamber have to leave. Take more of their time, because what's going to happen, they'll sit here until 9 o'clock, and then we'll adjourn, and they would have lost a half hour of time. So, does that require amending the agenda?
It doesn't, but I think we.
Yeah. So we can reschedule the chamber.
Mark. We'll come back next.
Yeah.
We will.
Thank you, Mr. Jessup. Thank you. All right. And you've got somebody here as well. Yes, I just gave it. Yeah, thanks for being here. Okay, I'm going to go back to Commissioner Jackson now, who's remember what you were
I remembered my final question, and that is, if and when that apartment building gets built, would the revenues from that also be pledged to pay off the TIF note?
Yes, they would. A portion of them.
Okay, great. Thank you.
That's the $5 million part. The apartment building, the Site A, or the...
That's part of the conundrum. The amount of incremental taxes generated from the office is big. The amount of incremental taxes from the residential building is enormous. And so, like if the world were reversed, if the residential were ready to go first and the office lagged a couple years, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But yeah, when the residential is finished, a portion of those incremental dollars would support the payment on the parking. That's how it was originally structured.
Mr. Richard, do you have a segue outside the same issue?
Yes. There was a slide, so I appreciate Commissioner Jackson's correction, but I want to make sure then that I may have misinterpreted one of your slides. I thought you said that we were already at a deficit, and the slide had interest rates on it, and you had a $4 million deficit And so I was interpreting that to mean we had a shortfall, and I was assuming that we were going to cover that shortfall. You'd be coming back at some point wanting to cover that with TIF or some other loan. And so that's where I was getting you're asking for more money from. And so I may have been misinterpreting that, but if you could clarify that, that'd be great.
Sure. I think you did misinterpret that. So initially, the TIF pledge, we were aiming to fill a $22 million gap, and the TIF revenue stream would have filled that. But today, with the change in the interest rates, the TIF revenue doesn't come to 22 million, it only comes to 17 because of that higher interest rate. So by restructuring the deal and using the city's ability to get tax-exempt borrowing as a AAA rated city, we can bring that interest rate back down. So we're still at the same $22 million, it's just how we get there is different.
Thank you.
Commissioner Risser.
Well, I have actually been in the middle of a lake bailing water in a small boat, so I'm going to continue Commissioner Pierce's analogy. And in that situation, I was the bailer, but I was with people who knew what they were doing, and one of them reached down and grabbed a raggedy T-shirt and used it to plug the hole, and we hung out on the lake. Which was a very cheap solution, and it strikes me that the patch being proposed today is a very expensive one for several reasons. And I do appreciate going last because this is a project that I was not on city council or the HRA when this came forward, and so just kind of feeling like I'm playing catch up. But I went back and I reviewed so much of the information, and one of the consistent messages for this project in front of the planning department or commission, in front of council, and also to the city, even in an agenda Edina message, was that we do pay as you go, and there's no risk to the city. There's no risk, we do pay as you go. And I also went back and realized this was one of the most contentious TIF districts that was created, and there wasn't a lot of public support for it. So to hear this potential, and I wrote down, what a loophole. You don't have to have a public hearing, but you can take an established TIF district and rejigger the financing so that it is no longer pay as you go. It becomes very different from that, and move away from the commitment. And so that made me really think about our tax increment financing policy, so I went back and I looked at that. And the fourth bullet is ensure that TIF is used in a transparent, consistent, and equitable manner to provide value to the community. And I feel this change is going to be going in the opposite direction. It also opens the door. Can any other entity that has received TIF financing come before us and say, we would like to have the same kind of deal going on. We'd like to have the city assume part of the risk, and we need that to happen. Our project's not moving forward. The whole impetus for this is to jumpstart a project. There still isn't financing that has been pinned down, it appears. So that raises concerns in my head. Is it really the role of the HRA to function in that kind of manner, to be reviewing potential investments and to be saying, okay, this is one where we should place city resources on the line and back? And I feel like that's kind of going beyond our purview. Admittedly, I haven't been this concerned about a project since the summer of '23, when we had two special HRA meetings that were specifically held in order to award $2.5 million to the Solem development. And I ended up abstaining from that vote because I felt I didn't have enough information. And I remember thinking, the whole purpose of this is to provide support so that a grant to the state housing agency will be stronger. And then it turned out, and during both of those meetings, there was no mention of the sewer capacity and that was a huge, huge thing, and that was not even part of the discussion, and I really think it should have been. And then things ended up happening, and we, are where we are right there, and that got delayed. But I'm also wondering, what don't I know about this project? Because we can say, oh, it's all about the parking ramp, and it's all about financing that, but the other thing that struck me as I reviewed was the consistent messaging that this would be the first Class A office building built in 20 years. It's likely not going to be the first because we've already got another one across the way that is actually being built. And then we have one scheduled for the Macy's furniture site. We have another one here on Eden Avenue. And so there will be, if all of those go forward, this could be the second or the third or maybe the fourth. And one thing that is stuck in my head is by removing the parking from the office building and putting it in a separate space, off-site parking, that's something that I believe the other 3 Class A office buildings are not doing. And so they will be able to have 100% parking needs in a contained, heated, secured parking facility. And I just wonder, if that's going to be something that investors are going to say, I'm not so sure I want to invest in that. I mean, there's so many things that I feel like I don't know. If we could go back to that slide that talks about discussion, and with the questions on it. Yeah. I don't think we can do this without possibly risking our credit rating. And, as you stated, you never really know until it happens. Your rating falling, and so that's a concern. I do see risk. I don't see much benefit in taking on this risk. I think it provides precedent that is very concerning. I also saw the slide that showed what if we gave TIF financing to this project by 2026, it would have the property value, the estimated market value would have risen from 14.9 million to 184.8 million, and annual property taxes paid would have skyrocketed from $484,579 to $2,467,494. And I feel like I keep getting figures that come before me, and then they don't necessarily pan out. And so when I look at the projections of what could be generated to pay back a loan, I really question that. The other thing is that question to consider, number 4, is the HRA willing to see the anticipated $250 million investment vision for the site not realized? I think that's really not a fair question. I think it implies that it's all on us. And I think there's so much that is beyond our control. And I agree with Commissioner Pierce that it could be the project that needs to be reconsidered. Finally, I don't remember seeing this in the packet, the presentation that we just received. If that could be added so that the public can see that. And I'm somebody who is a process thinker, and I really need to see things in advance of meetings. Otherwise, all I can do is react to them. And it just feels hard because I feel like I'm not serving the people as well as I could be. So it'd be great if we could get presentations ahead of time. Thank you. Oh, wait, I do have a specific question. What grants have been pursued to support this project?
For this one, we have one grant from DEED, about $625,000 to partially reimburse them for some of the site work.
Are there any other grant applications in the hopper?
Not for this site, When it's in this in-between phase, we don't pursue grants. It's not worth the time.
Because it is one of the recommended terms that the developer must pursue grants from other agencies to reduce reliance on TIF.
Yep.
So I just wanted to ask.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah, and they did that initially. We did obtain that deed grant through their application. And my apologies for not having the report in. I've been out sick the last 2 days and just did it last night. It's the same content. I copied it from the staff report. I just put it on the PowerPoint and added some pictures.
You.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Anhut, could you come up, please? We've got I think a uniform concern, not only amongst staff, but amongst commissioners, about mitigation of risk. So this risk mitigation issue is critically important. On the pay-go note, the burden was on the developer, and the question now becomes, do we want to try to make something work? I don't think it's really, parking is the mechanism we're using to make the whole project work. So it's not really about parking in a sense. We want to see this $250 million project come to fruition, and can we do that without changing or creating any risk to our bond rating or adding additional risk to the taxpayer? I think that's kind of at the core of it. And you've been probably critical in helping on this analysis, and we're getting a sense from Director Neuendorf that there probably is a little bit more risk than what we would have had just using a TIF pay-go note. So I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit. That could help us understand the incremental increase in risk if we choose to pursue this further in some way, I guess is one way to put it.
Certainly, Mr. Chair, members of the board. So the discussion that's been had is how do we utilize the tax increment that has already been pledged to this project in perhaps a different way than was originally envisioned to try to, again, offset some of those changes in interest rates and other factors that are making the project infeasible at this point in time. And I think the analogy I'll give is essentially they're asking for, the pay-go note is basically putting everything onto the developer's back. They're obtaining the funds, the loans, the equity investment, everything to build the entirety of the project. You're promising them that you'll reimburse some of those expenses through the tax increment, allowing them to access that revenue stream to help supplement that private financing. In this case, they're telling you the private financing is not coming through, right? The original terms of that, it's just not enough. That uncertainty is not enough to get us to that full capacity we need to actually build this project. And so now they're basically asking for you to co-sign their loan, right? That's essentially what is being asked, is that now the city, the HRA, whatever that entity is, whether it's through a lease, whether it's through maybe the HRA issuing its own debt to fund the project, but now we're co-signing that lease. So the increment is exactly the same. The amount of revenue that's coming, the projections are not changed at this point. We haven't changed the scope of what's being built. But now instead of all of that risk falling to the developer, if the TIF doesn't come in, that's something they need to make up for to pay off those loans. Now, if we're the co-signer, the HRA, if there's that same shortfall, now we need some mechanism to be able to fill it because, our name is on the line, right? So it is an increase in the risk profile. We're not putting any more public resources necessarily into it. If the TIF all plays out the way we want it to, great, everything's good. But we all know that that's uncertain. And so are we willing to put the name of the HRA behind it and try to work out mechanisms, whether it's through the agreement, maybe we require that they put a guarantee on top of that cosign so that there is something to backfill the revenue. We use assessments like Mr. Neuendorf mentioned, parking revenues on top of the equation, things like that. We can definitely work towards to try to mitigate that risk, but ultimately now we're co-signing this. And so that's the fundamental question that is being posed to you this morning, is whether or not that change is warranted for this particular project. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, to put it in your, yeah, it does help, I think, a great deal. And put it in your vernacular, does the potential co-signing on the loan create risk for our overall double AAA bond rating?
It adds to the equation, is what I'll say. And so does it add risk to that evaluation? Absolutely. They're going to treat it, you're co-signing a loan, now that's part of your portfolio.
Sure.
Right? That you would evaluate at the bank or wherever. Is that enough to change that credit rating? On its own, I would say I don't expect that. It's a $17 million commitment, roughly, that we're talking about for this project. In the grand scheme of things of the city, I don't think that by itself moves the needle. But we know that there are other things that you want to finance in the future. We know that there are projects right now that are coming forward using the sales tax, new facility needs. There's always street and infrastructure needs that you're going to be relied upon. So it's part of that mix. And if the sum of all of those things gets too large so that the city's finances, your financial statements are not able to demonstrate that it carries that same profile going forward, then it will move the needle. Just for context, roughly right now, the HRA, the city of Edina, you've carried over the past couple of years, kind of in a stable sense, roughly $160 to $180 million worth of long-term liabilities in your debt portfolio. So if you add 17 to that, that's roughly a 9–10% increase on top of what you already have. I don't think that's enough on its own to move the needle, but when you add other things over time, it's certainly something that we want to manage together with your capital improvement plan.
Okay, that's very helpful. I remember Commissioner Jackson asked that question in a real artful way and you answered it. We talked about it's really substituting TIF funds. I mean, we're going to capture that increment in a different way, just not through a formal TIF mechanism. So then the other part of the equation that was important that I had also thought about exploring a little bit is because it seems to me that the ability or the inability to secure the TIF district extension is kind of critical to this overall analysis. And I think, her suggestion about tabling, we can talk about that, but it'll come up in the context of what we decided to do here this morning. I think it'll probably answer itself. But I was on a virtual call with our city manager, with the chair of the tax committee from the House. I didn't leave that virtual meeting feeling confident that we would get that extension, because we asked for two things. We asked for a waiver on sales tax for construction materials for all the work we're doing under the sales tax. That we got totally rejected on, I thought. She just dismissed that out of hand. The theory being that why should one level of government pay sales tax to another level of government? Well, her answer was because we need it. We need it for our state. We need it for towns that don't have the prosperity that Edina has. We need it for education systems in greater Minnesota. So I got that. I understood that. And we've been, this takes us down a little bit different pathway, but we're a city that helps other places in the state, always. We don't get local government aid. We are a contributor to fiscal disparities to help other towns. And this is another way that I perceived that the tax chair is telling us, you're going to help. We're just not going to give you tax relief. But I also didn't leave there with, I felt like it was like 50-50 chance we'd get this extension on the TIF. I don't know. That was just my personal feeling. I don't know how Manager Neal felt, but.
I think we've had a subsequent discussion with our lobbyist and some of the other communities that have similar asks. It's a little more positive than 50-50, but not much more. given that it is moving forward and there's a dozen or more other communities that have similar asks. But it's not guaranteed for sure.
No. Okay. So we approved this project in a whole different kind of economic environment, and then a lot of things happened that affected the whole world. And it's still the site it always was. It's just a great site right in the middle of, right in the heart of our commercial district. But you can't help also musing over the question that Commissioner Pierce raised, and that is, do we have the right project? Or now does it feel like we're jamming a square peg in a, trying to jam a square peg in a round hole? And that's not only for us, but it's for the developer too. But they've been diligent about going forward, and we've always had good candor from the developer. And I'm just wanting him to come back up now, Mr. Carlson. And you've got I know you've got a tremendous investment here, you and Mortensen, Ryan and Mortensen. And do you feel like we're trying to jam a square peg in a round hole now because of conditions that none of us could control, and we don't have the right project anymore for a great site?
I appreciate the direct question. Thank you, Chair Hovland. I do not. One of our primary roles as a development partner with Mortensen on this is to understand the market. And I've got 25 plus years of experience in negotiating commercial leases, not only in the Twin Cities, but across the country on behalf of many small, medium, and large corporations. And I can tell you without a doubt that what we have programmed for that office site is desirable and is wanted by occupiers, despite of headlines to the contrary. And so from that perspective, I believe that the demand for office is growing for sites like this in excellent communities. And I believe that if we are able to have some success at the state legislature to extend this TIF district, that we can build the office project. I also think that, we still hold sacred to a lot of the site use requirements with grid and rooms and public amenities that I think above and beyond, including some design elements. So I think as we think about what is the project today and what was it 5 years ago or 3 years ago when it was approved, the programming piece for the office component remains unchanged, that it's desirable and well-liked. And the reason it didn't happen 3 years ago is collapse of financial markets as it relates to real estate. And interest rate risk has gotten out of control and is starting to level off. So to wrap up my comments, if we're successful in getting additional time from the state, I think this discussion is really helpful for us. And then we can determine later if there's an opportunity to further explore a different mechanism that provides us a path in the private markets to finance this project without putting you and the city at any greater risk.
All right, well, let's assume that we get that extension on the TIF request, TIF district request. And let's turn then to the question, or the way that Mr. Anhut framed it, was that we're really being asked to co-sign a loan with you. And so what have you been thinking about? And I think Manager Neundorf mentioned a few of these options to mitigate our risk. What have you been thinking about that you're willing to do as a developer to create no more risk for the city than it has under the presently approved model if we went ahead and co-signed that loan with you to back us up?
That's a great question. When I find that I'm negotiating and I want performance security, I find the best option to get that is a letter of credit.
Okay.
And I would defer to Nick and others to the value or power of a letter of credit, but in the world I operate, that's a very strong mechanism to mitigate financial risk.
Yep. So you answered that a little bit in the abstract. So what I hear you saying, and knowing you, is that you're willing to extend a letter of credit.
Quite possibly, yes.
Okay. Well, as long as this is just a discussion about
This is a
possibilities.
discussion, yes.
We're in the world of possibilities.
Yes.
here.
But all joking aside, if for the follow-up, like that's what I would want to know. So I appreciate you framing it the way you did, Mr. Anhut. And then so my follow-up would be, if that's the ask, I want to see all of the various ways of mitigating or eliminating as much of the risk as possible. And just from the material, like we haven't gone through, maybe we have, it just doesn't feel like we've gone through like we haven't done an exhaustive view of how to reduce the risk. Maybe we have. I'm hoping you're going to stand up and say, you're right, we haven't. There's other things we can look at, but maybe not.
You're right. We have not taken a full deep dive. You've noticed there's no specific cost, there's no specific schedules. Before we spend all the time and effort to try to figure out every detail, we wanted to see what your general feelings were about the concept. We could spend 3 months working 8 hours a day to get this figured out. But if we do that and bring it back to you and you say, no, we're not comfortable with this, we've just wasted a whole lot of time and money. And so we want to gauge your comfort level before we take that deep dive.
So, yeah, I mean, undergirding this is the question I think you impliedly asked us to think about was, why would the city do what the private markets won't do? And, when you think about, if we tried to reload, A, we don't have the use of TIF because it's no longer meets the blight test. B, it might mean that we don't get the things that we thought were important to get, that we wanted, cut up that 6 acres, create all these public elements that you walked through so well this morning. Those are important considerations for us as well, to get what we want in terms of the future development of our community out of that site that we were able to accomplish with a public investment through the TIF. So back to Commissioner Risser's, she said, I'm not even sure this is our role. Well, the role, this is the very role of the HRA, frankly. The purpose of the HRA in Edina, and you can pull it up quickly online, is to undertake urban redevelopment projects. And that has a broad sort of definition, and I think this fits right in that definition, is that this is an urban redevelopment or a suburban redevelopment project that we approved, that we're trying to figure out how to get what we want out of it and preserve a $250 million opportunity for our community. And the other part of the responsibility of the HRA is to assist in the development of affordable housing projects. Well, that's not applicable here. It is somewhat, because with the apartment portion of it, 10%. But so really an interesting discussion this morning. So when I look at these questions, oh, here they are up on the screen. I was trying to look at my computer. To the other question that Member Risser raised that she thought was unfair, number 4, I think something will happen there that will be good if we didn't do this, but are there reasons to try to explore this further to make it work? This is just me thinking out loud now. So if we could, for me, if we could explore these ideas further without enhancing the risk profile for the city, I'd be willing to take a look at that, because I think we've had a good project approved. If that means that we use our financing abilities potentially without increasing the risk to the city, I don't know why, I'd be comfortable exploring this further to see how it could potentially work to preserve what we thought we wanted to do in this part of town that was not only good for the private sector, but good for the public sector too. So, Commissioner.
Thank you, Mayor. I kind of echo some of the sentiments of I am nervous about this. I don't love investing into parking ramp as a city. I especially don't know that we need district parking on this site, so that adds to my hesitation. And I'm also nervous about doing it when there's still the open question mark about housing and the timing of that and how that will play into the repayment of this. So if we do explore it further, I'm not a hard no, right? Because we don't have all of the information. So I am okay with continuing to explore this. But I would for sure want to understand or explore charging both tenants of the commercial building as well as tenants of the residential building for parking in this site, just so that we're getting a benefit as a city for investing into this. So that would kind of be my summary thoughts. I know we're short on time, but it's at least worth a lot more conversation as a city council and HRA.
So you feel like going forward and exploring further to answer all these questions that create some anxiousness for all of us is okay. Commissioner Pierce.
I just wanted to be really specific on that point. I think you should come back with a forecast of revenues. And so, again, you haven't done the deep dive yet, but you've talked about a few constructs. If you take the pause and stop bailing and then really think about what you can come back with, I would come back with that revenue stream so that we can see how that risk profile is shaping up.
Commissioner.
So I'll repeat, I'm not going to bet on the legislature. I'm very nervous about whether a number of years we've not had a tax bill very high. So minimal work, I like the idea of what my fellow commissioners have said, but I really want to see that tax bill first.
Thanks. Yeah, I think we'll know in May. We would expect you to use your time as, you determine how best to spend your time, and I know this has some importance to all of us, but that tax bill is really critical. Commissioner.
Thank you. And I want to clarify, I do get that the role of the HRA is to help foster development in Edina. Where I feel we may be going beyond our purview is moving away from the original TIF agreement, taking on risk, and doing it specifically to spark developer or financial interest in a project. And I think there's a logic to saying, you should have the financing in place before starting the construction and, removing buildings and all of that. So I just wanted to emphasize that, but I also wanted to say I am in complete agreement with Commissioner Jackson. I think that's a very pragmatic thing to say, let's table this until we know what the legislature is going to do. And I do think that that is being very mindful and responsible of the time and the energy. And I do know, I do have another question though, in terms of all of the work that has gone in so far and representation from Ellers and everything, what is the revenue stream for covering those costs? Because I know with TIF, isn't it the developer pays for that? Is the developer paying for all of this?
That's correct. Yes, when we do TIF agreements with developers, they deposit a sum of money with the city that we hold in escrow to pay for our third-party costs. So the cost of Dorsey and Whitney, the cost of Ellers, and so we pull down from those funds.
That's being used for pursuing this change?
That's being used for this, yes.
Thank you.
It's at their expense.
You want to explain what you're thinking about?
Yeah, so the chair just asked me what I meant by things. You can continue to move forward on this, but I would not do a large investment of time between now and that tax bill getting signed by the governor with our provision in it, because I'm just, 50-50 is not a particularly good, I would put it at just any year regardless of getting a tax bill is pretty risky, so.
And so don't come back to us until after.
Yeah, don't come back to us until after we get that for sure.
We'll certainly be mindful of that, but also be aware our 5-year rule is 2027. So it's still 2 years out. We're not to the deadline yet, but we need to start preparing as if that deadline is approaching, because it's approaching quickly.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we'll be back in after that happens.
Okay. Okay.
From our perspective, thank you. This has been very helpful dialogue. So really appreciate your time and engagement this morning. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That was really quite a great conversation, really. I appreciate everybody's input. Really thoughtful all the way around. And thanks to Ellers, Mr. Anhut, for being here this morning and helping guide us and understand what we're looking at here. All right. We're a little bit over time. Is there anything else for the good of the order here? Otherwise, we'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Got a motion by Commissioner Pierce and a second by Commissioner Jacks to adjourn the meeting of the HRA. Any further discussion? All right, all those in favor of adjournment, say aye.
Aye.
Aye, opposed, carried. The HRA meeting on this Thursday, March 27, 2025 is adjourned.